Sharf, and on behalf of the Center for Buddhist Studies, I'd like to invite you all to the annual Khyentse lecture. In just a moment, Jake Dalton, who's a member of the group in Buddhist Studies, is going to introduce our speaker, Matthew Kapstein. But I'd first like to do something that is a great pleasure that we've been able to do for the last 2 years. This is the third year where we present the annual Khyentse Prize, which goes to an undergraduate student for outstanding achievement in their area of interest, which hopefully has some overlap with Buddhist studies. And this year it was a very quick decision to nominate Kelly Powell for the prize. Kelly's a senior here. She transferred in from Fresno City College a couple years ago. It actually shows that the old Clark Care California system still works. We do still have a lot of transfer students from community colleges to Berkeley, and they're generally a very interesting and dynamic and creative group. Since Kelly came, she has been very intensely involved in the study of Buddhism and Buddhist languages. She's in her second year of Sanskrit, her first year of Tibetan. She's a religious studies major with a concentration in Buddhist studies. I think she's considering a Buddhist studies minor, which I'm always amazed at when anybody considers a Buddhist studies minor. I'm still trying to get my mind around what it is. But Kelly is a straight A student since she transferred here. And she's really been remarkably serious and focused and excited about her study of Buddhism. So what I'm going to do is invite Kanjoli Che, who has been a wonderful partner from the Khyentse Foundation and working with the Buddhist Studies program at Berkeley, up on behalf of the Khyentse Foundation to give Kelly, do you want to come up? To give Kelly the prize, which includes not only a certificate saying you are the prize winner, but also a very generous check. So. You, one more. Thank you. Thanks a lot, and congratulations.
Thank you very much.
So now, Jake, where are you? Take over.
So hello, welcome everyone to our fourth Khyentse lecture. First, I just want to do a little plug for a talk that's coming up on March 1st that our current Shinzo Ito postdoc, Jan Ronis, will be giving on the subject of contestation over heritage and the constraints of history in the revelation of treasures at Katok Monastery in eastern Tibet in the 17th century. So that's on March 1st. So today, I'm very happy to be introducing our speaker, Matthew Kapstein. Matthew is the Numata Visiting Professor of Buddhist Studies at the University of Chicago Div School and the Director of Tibetan Studies at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris at the Sorbonne. And I have to say also, from a young age, as a Nyingma scholar myself, he's been a hero of mine and a kind of model to at least dream that I might someday aspire towards. I first sort of encountered him through his maybe most read work, this huge history of the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism that he published along with Gyurme Dorje in 1991. And I read the entire thing cover to cover, 800 pages or something. First. it was yeah. And then after that, as a graduate student, I remember I somehow got myself wormed into these little Nyingma meetings, and I remember sitting in the back of cars listening to Matthew and Stephen Goodman, who's here, and David Germano, and all these scholars of Nyingma Buddhism. And I just remember sort of sitting in the back after dinner and listening to these stories and dreaming of Nyingma studies. All very nerdy, but I loved it. But really far beyond mere sectarian scholarship on the Nyingma school, and even far beyond any academic disciplinary boundaries, what's really remarkable about Matthew is the breadth of his knowledge and interests. He truly embodies the life of a philosopher and an intellectual. And this is seen in his, repeatedly in his really stellar resume. He actually started as an undergraduate studying Sanskrit here at UC Berkeley, and then went on to complete his PhD, not in Buddhist studies or Tibetan studies, but in philosophy, in fact, at Brown University. And you can really see this philosophical interest in all of his writings. In 1986, he joined the University of Chicago, where he taught until 1989, and then moved to Columbia University from 1989 to 1996, so for 7 years. And then he went back to Chicago, where he's been since 1996. And in 2002, he then joined the Sorbonne, and since then has had this kind of dual appointment, flying back and forth. You never know where he's going to be. Matthew's also been really incredibly prolific. In addition to this Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism I already mentioned, he's the author of many books. The Tibetan Assimilation of Buddhism, Conversion, Contestation, and Memory is another one that I remember reading cover to cover, taking a good couple of weeks out of my life to just stop and pore over the footnotes at length. He's edited volumes such as Buddhism in Contemporary Tibet, Religious Revival and Cultural Identity, on the sort of modern situation in Tibet. And this sort of goes hand in hand with the fact that in addition to being so well-read, he travels constantly and spends a huge amount of time in Tibet. I've been to, caves in the middle of nowhere in eastern Tibet where people pull out his business card and say, "Do you know?" So he's really everywhere. I guess I'll leave it at that, and please join me in welcoming Matthew.
Thank you very much, Jake. I must confess to being more than a bit embarrassed. Coming back to Berkeley, I see so many teachers and friends and faces I've known for so long that some of you I think of virtually as family. I feel almost like Arjuna at Kurukshetra, except without the problematic aspect of the recognition. Before I begin, first of all, I'd like to offer some thanks, first of all, of course, to Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche. And I should recount that I first met Khyentse Rinpoche 40 years ago when he was a young boy, and I was interviewing his teacher, the late Khenpo Abe Rinpoche, one of the leading scholars of the Sakyapa order. And Khyentse Rinpoche was being a kind of mischievous child. He would hide behind Khenpo Abe Rinpoche's chair, and as the conversation would start to get serious about the Madhyamaka philosophy of Gorampa, he would kind of peek out and start making faces at me, try to get me to crack up a bit. At any rate, it's been, of course, wonderful to see all that he has accomplished since, and with the invitation to give this year's Khyentse lecture, to be in some small way a part of his very widespread activities. I thank also, of course, the Berkeley Center for Buddhist Studies, Jake Dalton for inviting me in the name of the center and the Khyentse Foundation, and Sanjo Mandal of the Center for the logistical support. So, my title is Tibet in the Age of Manuscripts, and to begin, it is a title that is much too broad. The Tibetan age of manuscript culture began perhaps during the 7th century, and surviving evidence extends at least as far back as the 8th. At the other extreme of Tibetan history, it may be argued that the manuscript was never superseded as the favored medium for the conservation, reproduction, and distribution of Tibetan literature, at least until the last few decades. I experienced something of the situation that persisted over the past 3 or 4 centuries during the first years of my studies in Nepal during the 1970s. Among the culturally Tibetan communities of the Himalayan valleys of Nepal, some xylographic printing houses did exist, but they had blocks for only a narrow segment of the text that were in fact in circulation. And as the printeries rarely produced works for sale to casual visitors, arranging for copies to be printed from the blocks that they did possess could be a time-consuming, expensive, and often frustrating process. One had to provide the appropriate paper and ink oneself, for these were seldom readily available. And what was often more of a challenge, one had to locate and hire someone skilled at printing. The work could only be done during the warmer months of the year, but not at the height of the monsoon, when the blocks couldn't be dried properly after use and so were liable to rot. And as a minimum, one had to print about 8 or 10 copies of any item, as the printing process rendered it impractical in the extreme to produce only 1 or 2 impressions. It was thus usually easiest just to have someone prepare copies of a desired text by hand, or to write it out oneself. We would be in error, therefore, to assume, as in the bar above, that with the adoption of xylographic printing in central Tibet during the 15th century, the time of Gutenberg, the Tibetan age of manuscripts came abruptly to an end. Rather, the slow advance of printing, beginning in the 12th and 13th centuries, when Tibetan works were first published in Xixia and Mongol China. Here you have one of the earliest dated Tibetan books printed, and down to the tremendous expansion of traditional printing after the mid-17th century, when the major printing houses of Lhasa, Shul, Nartung, Dege, and Labrang, among others, were established, gradually encroached upon the domain of the manuscript, but printing never quite supplanted it. Nevertheless, the progress of Tibetan printing was not without consequence for the world of the manuscript. The authors whose works came to be most widely distributed and best known were generally those whose writings were printed, and the works of authors who achieved prominence as teachers after the print revolution of the 15th century were far more often xylographically published than those of earlier masters, whose writings, with a small range of notable exceptions, were often left in obscurity. This tendency to favor recent writers and to forget those who had been active in the past came to be greatly magnified in the 17th century, when the 5th Dalai Lama seized and placed under seal entire monastic libraries, an issue to which I shall return shortly. For the moment, let us note just that by removing so many manuscript sources from circulation, the very possibility of copying, much less publishing, large numbers of early works was denied. Although manuscript preparation remained an important aspect of book production in Tibet, the works copied by hand were now very often works also extant in print editions. As an example, a Tibetan friend once presented me with a lovely old manuscript of the 5th Dalai Lama's commentary on Dundin's Kavyadarsha. I briefly harbored the hope that this marvelous gift might be a witness quite apart from the well-known xylographic editions of the text, but it soon became apparent, on the contrary, that it was a faithful copy of the old Schul printery edition. In short, although manuscript culture remained active in Tibet down to very recent times, it was increasingly limited by, and in large measure even dependent upon, the growing world of print. Determined scholars did sometimes seek to locate and publish old and rare works that had escaped the Great Fifth's literary dragnet. This was a noteworthy feature of the researches of the 19th century figures associated with the so-called Rime movement, for example. But many once famous writers were known only in name, and some forgotten altogether. The print world and the manuscript culture that continued to coexist with it were like the tip of the proverbial iceberg, beneath which the great sunken mass of early manuscripts remained securely hidden from view. I should add, too, as a matter of clarification, that the part of the age of manuscripts that concerns me here starts roughly with the so-called later diffusion of Buddhism beginning towards the end of the 10th century. As we know from Dunhuang, and to a lesser extent from other collections that have come to light, there was a rich Tibetan manuscript culture that arose under the old Tibetan Empire and persisted, albeit with important modifications, during the immediate post-imperial period. Much of the recent scholarship that really focuses on Tibetan manuscript studies has been devoted to this early material, and Professor Dalton has been a very active contributor in this domain. A major problem, however, remains the precise relationship between the late first millennium writings and what came afterwards. Surely there were some important continuities. The copious transmission of imperial period canonical translations demonstrates this. And in a few cases, the collections of Tabo Monastery in Spiti, Himachal Pradesh, and those of Unkeru Temple in central Tibet are noteworthy examples. We do have materials that in some sense bridge the early and later periods, and that demonstrate that the gulf separating them was not so abrupt as Tibetan historical mythology pretends. The ongoing analysis of these collections promises to do much to enlarge our understanding of the manner in which early Tibetan manuscript culture informed the so-called later diffusion. However, this important story will not be my topic this evening. Following the tortured events of the 2 decades beginning in 1959, it first appeared that whatever manuscript collections had survived in Tibet would remain off-limits to scholarship for the long term. In the meantime, and thanks in no small measure to the pioneering efforts of the late E. Jean Smith in New Delhi, beginning during the late 1960s, Tibetan manuscript holdings in South Asia, including both those that had been brought out by refugees and those that belonged to culturally Tibetan communities from the Himalayan regions stretching from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh, began to be exploited more or less thoroughly, and some part of their riches made accessible through photolithographic reproduction in India. Some of these were works of great rarity and exceptional value. As, for example, the collected writings of the great 15th century author Serdok Panchen Shaji Chogden, preserved in a unique 18th century manuscript commissioned by the 9th J. Kembo of Bhutan, Shagyerinchen. Nevertheless, even with the revelation of tens of thousands of works conserved in South Asia, it became ever more apparent that important lacunae remained, above all when one sought to fill in the record prior to the 15th century. And in the case of those traditions that had been condemned by the Great Fifth, even down to the 17th. But as the limits of the resources available in South Asia began to be felt during the 1970s and 80s, it became apparent, too, that the volume of material conserved in China and Tibet far exceeded our expectations. An instance of this was the discovery in 1990 of a local Eastern Tibetan lithographic reproduction of a manuscript set of the writings of Dolpobe Sherab Gyaltsen, a 14th century figure whose controversial role in the history of Tibetan Buddhist thought was known in a general sense to Western scholarship, but of whom less than a quarter of the literary production had so far become available up to that time. By 1990, when Dolpoba's works came to light, it was already clear that Tibetan texts had fared relatively better during the years of the Cultural Revolution than had most other areas of Tibetan culture, or indeed of most any culture in China, during that harrowing period. Although very large numbers of temples and monasteries had been demolished, their libraries were in many cases removed, and substantial collections were incorporated into the holdings of the Nationalities Cultural Palace in Beijing. These Tibetan collections, by the way, have now been mostly returned to Tibet. Besides this, a number of important libraries had survived in situ, including the massive collections of Labrang Monastery in Gansu, as well as substantial collections in the Potala and Norbulinka in Lhasa, at Tashilhumbo, Sakya, Zhalu, and Khyentse in Sang, and at Palbung and Katok in Kham, and of course many smaller collections, including some that had been cached during the most difficult years, resurfaced as well. The mother lode, however, though its existence seems to have been known to some beginning perhaps in the 1980s, only came to light publicly at the start of the new millennium. These were the more than 20,000 texts hidden at the Nechu Temple of Drepung Monastery in the suburbs of Lhasa. In this case, the books had not been concealed to protect them during the Cultural Revolution, but rather in the time of the fifth Dalai Lama in order to take them out of circulation altogether. And these are just some pages from the published hand list of this collection. Though it had long been known that the Great Fifth had placed a certain number of works under seal, above all those by authors of the Jonangpa order, such as Dolpoba, whom he opposed, no one had previously suspected the scale of his efforts to control Tibetan writing. It soon became evident that he was not so much concerned to ban particular authors as he was to bury entire libraries. For their holdings that were in no way offensive to the Dalai Lama's sensibilities, such as copies of the writings of Tsongkhapa, were in fact sealed up along with the rest. At the same time, as we shall see, the Great Fifth took care to install certain collections in which he was himself interested in his personal library. For example, works of the Numata order are strikingly absent from the hoarded texts found at the Nechu Temple, but notably present in the holdings of the Potala Palace. Oops. I'm missing something, it's all right. The Nechu Temple's treasure trove thus primarily contributes to our knowledge of the Kagyu and Jonangpa traditions, as well as, most significantly, the early Kadampa, as represented in Kadampa philosophical writings above all. No single body of material that has come to light so far does more to advance our understanding of the development of Tibetan Buddhist thought during the crucial 3 centuries from about 1100 to 1400. And when the treasures of the Nechu Temple are complemented by those from Palbung, Sakya, and other collections in Tibet, as well, of course, as materials that have appeared elsewhere, the possibility of achieving a close reading of most of the important and many of the minor lineages and traditions of Tibetan Buddhism from the 11th through 15th centuries begins to come into view for the first time. In the remarks that follow, I shall briefly survey 4 cases to illustrate some of the prospects and challenges that have emerged. 2 of these pertain to the legacy and antecedents of the celebrated Nyingmapa master Longchen Ramjampa, and 2 to the teaching traditions of the Karmapa hierarchs of the Kagyu order. Longchen Ramjampa is often regarded as the greatest luminary of the Nyingmapa order, and as a writer of considerable literary merit. His work never went out of circulation entirely, and though sometimes studied and taught only among restricted circles, some of his writings began to be printed in the 16th century. During the 18th century, a great revival of interest in his oeuvre resulted in the publication of several fine xylographic editions of his collected writings and their extensive distribution. The corpus includes almost 400 titles. Some are short poems, while a few are multi-volume treatises, the whole filling over 20 large volumes in all. But it has long been clear that, with the passage of time, a number of his works, possibly including early writings on Indian Buddhist philosophy, had been lost. Just over 10 years ago, the Sichuan Nationalities Press issued a previously unknown treatise, the Tsema Dekona Nyidupa, which would be Pramana Tattva Sangraha, if the title were Sanskritized, a work on pramana, logic and epistemology, attributed to Longchenpa. The existence of such a work had indeed been rumored for some time, and for aficionados at least, its appearance was a cause for celebration. Given what was known of Longchenpa's early education at the College of Sangpu, the preeminent center for the study of pramana since the early 12th century, the work promised to clarify important aspects of this great writer's background and formation. The edition published in Sichuan publishes, of which you see the cover here, the edition published in Sichuan claims to be based upon two manuscripts. One kept in the Potala Palace in Lhasa and said to have been originally copied at the central Tibetan Nyingmapa monastery of Dojechak, and the other found at Palden Jamjor Monastery in Nyak Adzirong in Kham. The latter is described as an ancient cursive manuscript, but as the printed edition includes no reproductions of these manuscripts, nor indications of variant readings, we must assume that either the two manuscript sources are improbably similar, even if, as is probably the case, they represent a common stem, in fact one could have been a copy of the other, or, as is also likely, the editors have harmonized their readings without recording the variants. In any event, essentially all information of paleographical or codicological interest has been lost in the available edition, this being the normal and by no means exceptional fate of Tibetan writings at the present time. The basis for the attribution of the work to Longchenpa is a brief colophon which reads, Tseme Dekona Nyiduba Longchen Ramjamgi Jarawate Zoso. The Tsema Dekona Nyiduba, composed by Longchen Ramjamba, is concluded. Soon after the appearance of the work, however, it became apparent to some who read it that this attribution could not be correct. The first to report on his findings, with which I by and large concur, was Leonard van der Kuyp, who in an article appearing in the Journal of Indian Philosophy in 2003 wrote as follows. Contrary to Post Richter, referring here to the Tsema Richter of Sakya Pandita, one of the most famous treatises on pramana in Tibet, and as we've seen, one of the first Tibetan books that was actually printed. Contrary to post-Richter writings on Tsema that belong to the 13th century, the Tseme Dekona Nyiduba betrays no overt knowledge of Sakya Pandita's critiques of the Sangpu tradition. Thus, it contains neither arguments formulated in defense of theories characteristic of Sangpu, nor hints of an awareness of the Sakyapa commentarial literature that had in the meantime grown up around the Pramanavartika of Dharmakirti and the Tsema Richter of Sakya Pandita during the same period. These absences are, in my view, powerful indicators that the Tseme Dekona Nyiduba was written not by Longchenpa, but by a still unknown author who may have even composed it before circa 1219. End quote. Van der Kuyp recognized that, despite the improbability of Longchenpa's having been the real author, the text was exceptional for the extensive evidence it provided of intramural debates at Sangpu during the 12th century, that is to say down to about 1200, a century or so prior to Longchenpa's birth. But given this, he found the absence of evidence bearing on the work's own true authorship and reception to be puzzling. Or as he put it, again citing Van der Kuyp, the author of the Tseme Dekona Nyiduba provides us with many fresh insights in how certain ideas germane to Tsema, to Pramana, were developed in early Tibet because of his plethora of references to earlier writers and their theories, not to mention his own incisive analyses in which he demarcates his views from those entertained by others. But truth be told, there are no obvious indicators of how important his work might have been for the tradition itself. We know as yet nothing about the degree to which it was read or consulted in contemporary and later Tibetan scholarly circles. My own limited reading in the literature strongly suggests that it fell dead from the author's pen." End quote. Though such a conclusion was no doubt reasonable when van der Kuyp wrote it, thanks to more recent manuscript finds, it is now possible to resolve the conundrum somewhat, and to offer some indications bearing upon the question of the authorship and legacy of the text. Since 2006, the enterprising Paltse Penin Jimjuk project, directed by the Venerable Thupten Nyima Rinpoche, has been engaged in the publication of a series of manuscript reproductions of early writings of the Kadampa order discovered at the Drepung Nechu Temple, together with a small number of works found elsewhere. These have appeared 120 volumes so far under the general title of Kadam Sumbum Chokjik, the anthologized collected writings of the Kadampa. The reproductions, unfortunately, are not of sufficiently high quality for us to determine very precisely the age or provenance of the originals, except where these are specified in scribal colophons, as they but seldom are, and in many cases, too, finer annotations are too greatly reduced and not sufficiently resolved to permit decipherment. Nevertheless, as this is probably the only access we will have to manuscripts from the Nechu Temple for quite some time, we must make the best of what we find at our disposal. In the 88th volume of the series, we find a facsimile of a manuscript bearing the title Tseme Dekone Ni Dube Nyewar Duba, the abridgment of the Pramana Tattva Sangraha, authored by a certain Chogi Sheba. When I first noticed the title among the series' contents, I thought that it might be a summary of Shantarakshita's opus magnum, the Tattva Sangraha, which is usually referred to in Tibetan as the Tsema Dekone Ni Duba, and which, despite its importance for Tibetan knowledge of Indian philosophy, seems never to have been the subject of Tibetan commentary itself. The discovery of a Tibetan summary of it would therefore be a matter of considerable interest. On examining the work, however, I was surprised to find that it was in fact an abridgment of the very text attributed to Longchenpa. Clearly, van der Kuyp's conclusion that it fell dead from the author's pen would have to be revised. The real surprise, however, emerged only on studying the text more closely, for the author, the so far unknown Chogi Sheba, had taken care to reproduce in his work the contents of the original author's colophon within his own. Oh, that was reversed. Unfortunately, this computer is not set up with the type font that was needed to reproduce this correctly. I do apologize to you for that. One of the problems in living between Paris and Chicago is I don't always have the same materials everywhere, and I didn't have in Chicago the exact copy of the manuscript to scan for this talk. I just had my transcription of it, and unfortunately that is not reproducing correctly here. So what I'll do is I'll do it bilingually for those who know Tibetan and those who don't. Okay, so the colophon that we have in this text reads, there's first a part that I take to be either a paraphrase or more likely exact quotation of the original author's colophon. And this reads, the Tsema Dedungi Dekone Ni Dupa was composed during the 7th quincentenary period of the Sugata's teaching in the fire female ox year at the Tera Tashi Umang Monastery by one bearing the burden of ascetic discipline, the Shakya monk who has much studied the extensive Pitakas, the greatly learned Lama Dorje Wangjak. Okay, in Tibetan, I'll read it slowly. Tsema Dedungi Dekone Ni Dupa Shechawa Dewar Shepe Temba Ngabya Dumbala Pabetse Memolangi Lola Tera Tashi Umangi Gumba Tushuki Kurdzinchin Dena Ramjamla, Mangdu Tube Shage Gelong, Lama Keba Chembo, Doje Wamchaki Jarba. Okay, and then we go on with the part of the colophon that pertains to the abridgment of the work, which reads, Thence, the Shakya layman Chugi Jeba much studied it with the Lama himself, and after some years had passed, he was petitioned by Tuba Sonam Senge, the spiritual benefactor of Yagde, whereupon, on behalf of those who would be gladdened by an abridgment, he composed the Tsema Dekona Ni Dube Newar Duba, entitled Yeshe Dorje Rinpoche, which is here concluded. And so that reads, Shage Genyen Chugi Jebe, Lama Ngule, Mangdu Tude, Loshe Tsam Lumbe Tse, Yakte Geshe Tuba Sonam Senge, Soandabe, Jungze Dubala, Gawa Namgi Dundu Jarwe, Tsema Dekone Ni Dube Newar Duba, Yeshe Dorje Rinpoche Shechawa Zoso. This is followed by a short annotation written in a smaller script, which reads, It is a doctrine that has been well received from the learned Lama's pronouncements by the Shakya layman Chugilodra, except for, well received by the layman Chugilodra Iti, except for our own disciples, it has been placed under seal, Samaya. So that's Shagi Genyen Chugilodragi, Lama Kebe Kale Andapar Lawe Chuso, Iti, Rare Lobu Matopa Namle Kagyadzedo Samaya. There's a great deal of interest here, but for want of time, I will summarize my conclusions briefly without setting forth my arguments in full. First, although the apparent author of the Tsema Dekone Niduba, the Lama Dorje Wangchak, remains otherwise unknown, as is also the monastery at which he composed the work, Teratashi Umang, we may identify his disciple, the layman Chugisheba, the author of the summary text, with a 6th generation descendant and lineage holder of the great 11th century Nyingmapa master Rongzong Chugisangpo. Second, as the work which concerns the teaching of pramana at Sangpu was thus transmitted within a Nyingmapa lineage, and because the author Dorje Wangchak is described as having studied extensive Pitakas, Dena Rabjam, we can begin to see why at some point the Tsema Dekone Niduba came to be erroneously attributed to the Nyingma master Longchen Ramjam, who had, let us recall, studied at Sangpu and was styled Rabjam. Moreover, we can now assess van der Kuyp's conclusion that the author may have even composed it before circa 1219, a conclusion stemming in part from the complete absence within the work of any sign of familiarity with Sakya Pandita's Tsema Rikter, presumed to have been written in about 1219. In fact, the fire female ox here mentioned in the newly discovered colophon may be securely identified as corresponding to 1217, strikingly close to van der Kuyp's estimation. Last, but by no means least, we must emphasize the role of a lineage of laymen in the history of the work. Previously, we've had almost no knowledge of the lay transmission in Tibet of subjects like pramana. What now comes into view resembles the situation already described by Theodor Cherbatskoy in connection with later Buddhism in India, in which householder tantric adepts played major roles in the teaching of pramana. In the present case, however, we note too that learning seems to have been treated virtually as a guild secret. Except for our own disciples, it is placed under seal. In sum, then, Pake van der Kuyp, the Tsema Dekone Niduba did have a legacy, at least for some time, but that legacy was deliberately restricted by the lineage in which it was preserved. Hence, the Tsema Dekone Niduba and its abridgment are of importance not just for their contents, or for the considerable light these shed on the teaching of pramana at Sangpu, but for the unanticipated revelation they provide of the transmission of learning within lay Buddhist traditions prior to the emergence of what has been termed mass monasticism in Tibet, particularly during and after the 17th century. The second example I wish to introduce contributes further to our understanding of early Nyingmapa lay lineages. One of the significant puzzles in the history of Tibetan religious traditions remains the origins and early development of the esoteric contemplative and ritual tradition known as the Dzogchen Nyingtik, the seminal essence of the Great Perfection. This system finds its classic expression in the writings of Longchen Ramjamba, but it is by no means his invention, and it is clearly the product of an evolution extending back some generations before his time. Among the many works in which Longchenpa elaborates the Dzogchen Nyingtik teaching is a remarkable treatise called the Tsigdunze, the Treasury of Word and Meaning, or more idiomatically, the Treasury of Topics, Tsigdun being equivalent to Padartha in Sanskrit, in which Longchenpa organizes his exposition of the system following a scheme of 11 categories or topics beginning with the nature of the ground, that is, the foundational nature of reality, and the appearance of bewilderment within it, and tracing a progression from the potential of beings for enlightenment to the attainment of perfect freedom. This scheme is distinguished in the present context by its constant reference to the peculiar lexical and conceptual nuances of the Dzogchen Nyingtik, and it has been proposed that the elucidation of the origin of the 11 topics and the schematization of the system according to these 11 topics might help to clarify the origins of the system overall. Jean-Luc Achard, who pursued this question in his dissertation, suggested that Longchenpa's inspiration may have come from Bumpo sources, in particular the Yeti Garbo, which Achard believes to have been compiled during the 12th century, and which Achard asserts Longchenpa virtually plagiarized. Achard's hypothesis, however, raises a significant problem. For despite the evidence we do possess of interaction between certain Bumpo and Nyingmapa lineages during the period concerned, there really seems to be no positive indication, as Achard himself admits, of this in connection with Longchenpa. If his sources were Bumpo, he succeeded very well in concealing his tracks thoroughly. One hint regarding Longchenpa's possible source of inspiration in the composition of the Tsigdunze is in fact given in the hagiographical compilations of the Dzogchen Nyingtik lineage itself. This comes from the big red book that Jake referred to, where a purely Buddhist pedigree for the teaching is asserted. A 12th century layman, for the lineage appears to have been for some generations a lay succession within the Zhang clan, named Nimabum. I don't know how this. Nimabum is on the left. Is credited in the and this compilation of hagiographies, even though it's found here in Dunjam Rinpoche's recent work, is verbatim taken from Longchenpa's compilation of the hagiographies during the 14th century. Nimabum, at any rate, is credited with a work entitled the Tsigdun Chemo, the great work on the topics. Given the title, it has been long thought of within the tradition as the probable background for Longchenpa's treatise. But in the absence of the work itself, it was impossible to confirm this. Indeed, it was impossible to confirm that Nimabum was a historical figure and not a legendary construction of the hagiographers. A decade ago, and Jan Ronis will know something about this, a decade ago, a team documenting old manuscripts preserved at Palbong, the main monastery of the Kagyu order in the Dege district of Kham, photographed a beautifully calligraphed copy of a work entitled Zopa Chembo Tsigdun Chuchik, the 11 Topics of the Great Perfection, attributed to Zhang Keba Nimabum. The work is the product of remarkable erudition, and the frequent archaicisms and obscurities in the text suggest that it is indeed a product of the early centuries of the second millennium, and thus, in all probability, none other than the Tsigden Chenmo attributed to Nyima Bum by the hagiographical tradition. Even on cursory examination, it is clear that it was the model for Longchenpa's Tsigden Ze, as was duly noted by the scribe who prepared the extant copy. And in the last folio here, continuing on to the next folio, you have a scribal note that says this is the basis for, this is well known to be the basis for Longchenpa's Tsigden Ze. The volume in which it is, lost my place. The present copy, however, is in this case a late one. The volume in which it is found includes, in addition to the Tsigden Chuchik, a number of short texts of the Anu-yoga tradition of the Nyingmapa, and concludes with a scribal colophon, the end here, demonstrating that the entire manuscript was prepared on behalf of Jamyang Khyentse Wangbo, one of the leading teachers of the 19th century, and of course the lineage ancestor of Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche. Unfortunately, we have no evidence regarding the provenance of the original from which the present manuscript was copied. In all event, the work convincingly permits us to push our interrogation of the development of the Dzogchen Yingti to a period fully 2 centuries prior to Longchenpa, and within a distinctly Buddhist milieu, while we cannot exclude interaction with the Bumpo, because the text may be assumed to be closely contemporaneous with the Yeti Garpo studied by Ashar, we must reopen the question of the direction of influence between the Buddhists and the Bumpo connected with this Dzogchen tradition. Finally, the work demonstrates once again the role of early lay lineages in the transmission and production of knowledge. Let us remark, too, that while we have been able to date this manuscript to about the 3rd quarter of the 19th century on the basis of information contained in its colophon, it is desirable for future Tibetan studies that there be a rigorous effort, which there has not been to date, to describe and classify papers, inks, scripts, page layout, and so forth, as these may permit us eventually, in some cases at least, to judge the provenance and dating of manuscripts for the colophonic, when the colophonic evidence is lacking. And of course, we must recall that in any case, we need sometimes to be skeptical of colophonic evidence. And just for comparison, again, I go back to some of these early 2nd millennium manuscripts from Unkeru, and you can see immediately that there are very considerable differences in materials, layout, and so forth involved. And none of this has really been rigorously studied yet in the case of Tibetan manuscript traditions. Issues of a rather different sort have emerged in connection, I'll turn now to my 3rd case. Issues of a rather different sort have emerged in connection with the gradual rediscovery of the writings of Munke Khan's Tibetan guru, Karma Pakshi, whose relations with Munke's brother Kublai Khan grew famously troubled. Karma Pakshi is generally held to have been the first representative of the Tibetan institution of recognized hierarchical incarnation, and he is said to have authored a substantial body of writing, though despite his great importance in one of Tibet's preeminent religious lineages, that of the Karmapas, there is very little evidence that his works, with but one exception, were much copied or studied or even perused. They were certainly never printed. In 1978, an incomplete collection in 2 manuscript volumes, preserved in the library of the monastery in exile of the Karmapas, Rumtek, in Sikkim, was published under the title Gyatso Taekor, that is, the Limitless Ocean Cycle. It was attributed at the time to the 3rd Karmapa, Rangjung Dorje, who was Karma Pakshi's successor. This proved to be one of the rare misattributions that E. Gene Smith allowed to pass, for it soon became clear that the volumes were in fact part of the surviving writings of Karma Pakshi. Though the collection was incomplete, it also became possible to advance a hypothesis concerning the curious reception history of Karma Pakshi's writings, for his work seems stylistically very eccentric and sometimes almost impossible to comprehend, which may be the result of later scribes making an already bad business even worse. And perhaps even more significantly, they have very little to do with the distinctive traditions of the Kagyu order to which Karma Pakshi belonged, for they represent rather those of the Katok branch of the Numata order in which he was educated. Apparently, within his own school, his poor literary heritage was due to the fact that no one much knew what to make of him. His writing just didn't compute, either in terms of style or content. But this was just a hypothesis. Given the reticence in traditional Tibetan discourse to criticize, even indirectly, one's teachers, it would have been almost unthinkable for any historian of the Kagyu lineages to have commented on the neglect within the school of this Reverend Master's writings. With the exception of his autobiography, which was much quoted by later historians, therefore, his oeuvre had been, to all intents and purposes, simply forgotten. Beginning about a decade ago, a number of additional manuscripts of writings by Karma Pakshi, many not included in the Rumtek collection, began to be discovered in Tibet, principally at Balbong, one of the major Kagyu monasteries in Kham, in western Sichuan, as well as at the Nechu Temple in Japung. Some of these were photographed using high-quality digital equipment, and those responsible for this work did something marvelous that unfortunately has almost been systematically neglected in the publication or even photographing of Tibetan works. They recorded, in addition to the manuscripts themselves, the notes and slips that were bundled together with them. So here you see these pages from the Shulen Gyatsotai of Karma Pakshi. But this is just a note that was inserted there. It's not part of the Shulen Gyatsotai of Karma Pakshi. Okay, now in this case, the note is a signed comment, the autograph of a Kagyu Lama from Kham, in which he discusses precisely the stylistic difficulties that pose an obstacle to reading Karma Pakshi's works, as well as the particular difficulty encountered by those educated in the Kagyu order, who might be unfamiliar with Pakshi's Nyingmapa frame of reference. The note reads in part, although the form of expression in Karma Pakshi's works seems as if somewhat misconstrued, saying this very politely, they should be regarded as the works of a venerable Siddha that are not in the scope of conventional designation. If you are nonetheless certain with regard to them, then, because there is nowhere greater development of the essential points of the 9 vehicles proceeding from the Sri Guyagarbha, the Guyagarbha being one of the primary tantras of the Nyingmapa tradition, rather than letting his works lie to rot in darkness as they have done, I pray 1,000 times that you study them and come to know their meaning. The note is signed by one Gelong Tembe Nima, who, given his diction and his audacity in committing to writing the opinion that the second Karmapa's works seem somewhat misconstrued, must certainly have been no ordinary monk. Though I have not yet succeeded in determining with certainty his identity, it appears likely in this context that he is none other than the great Situ Panchen, whose writings are often signed Tembe Ninche or Tembe Nimorcheba. His remarks offer for the first time an explicit confirmation that indeed the style and subject matter of Karma Pakshi's writings account for his poor reception among his Kagyu successors. But how many Tibetan readers' notes have been neglected, misplaced, and even lost in the process of recovering texts for publication? There is no way for us to know, of course. What is certain is that the fetishization of the text at the expense of the physical media that have been the bearers and, as in this case, companions of the text, has restricted our access to material of inestimable value for our efforts to understand the cultural history of Tibet. We cannot imagine that the present case was the unique instance in which a learned Tibetan reader set down in his intimate jottings what could not otherwise be said openly. My final example concerns another work stemming from the tradition of the Karmapas, and one that bridges, in some sense, the worlds of manuscript and of print. Throughout much of the 15th and 16th centuries, the Kagyu order, and the Karmapa hierarchs in particular, enjoyed positions of preeminence in the turbulent confrontations of religious and political leadership in Tibet. Though a few important xylographic printeries associated with the Kagyu that flourished during that period have left significant traces, one thinks of the publication efforts of Tsanyun Heruka at Rechungpuk, or of Dakpo Tashi Namgyal at Daklagambo. A very large part of Kagyu literary production of the 12th through 17th centuries effectively disappeared following the fifth Dalai Lama's suppression of much of the Kagyu order. Nevertheless, thanks again to recent discoveries at the Nechu Temple of Drepung, at Palbung, and elsewhere, a considerable volume of lost Kagyu writings has begun to resurface. In my search for missing writings of Karma Pakshi a few years ago, Gene Smith directed me to some scans and photographs that he had received and had incorporated into his TBRC database. One manuscript bundle in particular, which seems to have been found at Palbung, though I've not yet been able to verify this, consisted mostly of incomplete writings, including a substantial number of folios that were clearly from a work not by Karma Pakshi. The chapter colophons showed that these were from a tantric treatise entitled Karmape Gongba Selva Chebe Tenche Tarbe Lamchen Jube Shinta, that is to say, the chariot which traverses the highway of liberation, the treatise elucidating the intentions of the Karmapa. Eventually, going through the TBRC archive, I was able to reassemble one complete volume of what was clearly a multi-volume work, and that volume, now if one looks under that title in the TBRC database, that volume has been reassembled as one in the database. Included here too was, this is the first page of this work. Included here too was an interesting note attributing the text to the 8th Karmapa, Mikya Dorje, and stating that the work was borrowed during the 6th month of an Earth Tiger year, which I can't yet identify, from the Labrang Penza, Labrang not referring to the famous Labrang monastery in Gansu, but simply meaning the Lama's residence, from the library of the Lama's residence, for the purpose of carving blocks for publication. Though the work, which is in fact a very thorough tantric lamrim, surpassing even Tsongkhapa's famous Ngagrim in detail, is attributed in the note just mentioned to the 8th Karmapa, it was clear from the context nonetheless that it was based on his oral teaching and that the author of the written text must have been a disciple. If indeed it had been published xylographically at Palbung, for example, no trace of the xylographic print has so far emerged, despite the note that clearly refers to the manuscripts being designated for the preparation of a printed edition. The matter may soon be clarified, however, as I received word only last week that a typeset edition of the entire text is now in preparation in Lhasa. I will be curious to learn whether the sources for the parts of the work I could not locate among the images collected by the TBRC were the missing portions of the same manuscript, or another manuscript, or the elusive xylograph promised in the surviving library card. And by the way, the project in Lhasa has been able to identify that the author is Palkang Lotsawa, the second Karma Chinlepa incarnation, who was indeed a disciple of the 8th Karmapa. Okay. The enormous body of Tibetan materials that have become available as a result of publication efforts in recent decades has, of course, completely transformed the landscape of Tibetan studies, and what's more, transformed no less the ways and means of literary engagement in traditional Tibetan contexts, for instance at monastic schools. It must be noted, however, that these important developments have not been without attendant problems of various kinds, and it is with these that I will conclude. The overriding concern of recent Tibetan publication projects, both in South Asia and in China, has been to reproduce texts. This may seem self-evident and even trivial, but what I wish to stress is that in emphasizing texts almost exclusively, much that is of codicological interest has been neglected and perhaps sometimes lost. And this is true even where texts are published through the actual reproduction of manuscripts. For in many cases, the publications in question have included minimal or no information concerning the provenance and age of the manuscript, its dimensions, condition, the type and quality of the material on which it's written. In order to achieve the contrast required for black and white offset printing, tracing, retouching, and other manipulations have been employed in which data is obliterated, and in the worst cases, the text is gravely altered. Moreover, published manuscripts are almost always printed on a reduced scale with poor resolution, so that minuscule annotations and the like are frequently illegible. And in the drive to disseminate texts, we find an increasing tendency to prefer the use of word processing technologies to transcribe unpublished manuscript sources, inevitably introducing errors or misguided corrections into the text transcribed. All of this would be but slightly worrisome if the drive to publish texts were accompanied by a parallel drive to preserve, catalog, and make accessible to scholarship the original manuscripts. But with the exception of the fine efforts that have been undertaken at the National Library of Bhutan and the Tibetan Library of Works and Archives in Dharamsala, and perhaps a few other centers, this has not generally been the case. In China, there has, of course, been much attention to preservation and sometimes cataloging as well, but access remains difficult at best and is too often altogether out of the question. Though high-quality digital images of original manuscripts have sometimes become available, this remains quite rare relative to the quantity of the funds that exist. One of the brighter spots, the Nepal-German Manuscript Project, has microfilmed very large numbers of Tibetan manuscripts in Nepal and has attempted at least to record a minimum of pertinent codicological data accompanying their black and white images. Unfortunately, however, the minimum is seldom sufficient for serious codicological investigation. If, as I argued at the beginning of this talk, the Tibetan age of manuscripts, despite the presence of xylographic printing, did not really come to a close until quite recently, then Tibetan book culture may be said to have leapt almost directly from the manuscript age into the digital age, into the age of cloud computing. Obviously, such a great and rapid transformation of information technology cannot be accomplished without a degree of dislocation and violence. The concluding words of Anthony Grafton's eloquent essay, Codex in Crisis, bears repeating here. And Grafton writes, "Sit in your local coffee shop and your laptop can tell you a lot, especially if you wield your search terms adeptly. But these streams of data, rich as they are, will illuminate rather than eliminate the unique books and prints and manuscripts that only the library can put in front of you. For now and for the foreseeable future, if you want to piece together the richest possible mosaic of documents and texts and images, you'll have to do it in those crowded places where knowledge is still embodied in millions of dusty, crumbling, smelly, irreplaceable manuscripts and books." Thank you.
So we have time for some questions.
Yes?
I have, I think, 3 questions, if I could. The first is just a number. So, Gene Smith estimated the total corpus of Tibetan literature at about 60,000 volumes about a decade ago. I wonder if our Discovery manuscripts has significantly changed that.
Well, it depends on what you call a Tibetan volume. That really is the problem. When the hand list for the Nechu Lakang is about 22,000 titles, I think, but quite a few of these are short. They're not volumes. And I've heard different accounts of how many volumes are actually involved. But I mean, it's still a large number, 8,000, something like that. I really don't myself have any reason to want to challenge Gene Smith's estimate, and I think that in the fullness of time we'll know more.
Can I?
Sure.
So you mentioned that the Tsema Dekonani Dupa had been named as Kagyama, which I know is like something you would do to like a tantric ritual.
Well, that's
text.
what I'm.
Why would anybody ever do that to a text?
Well, that's why I made the reference to guild secrets. You see, I think that there is, again, a tendency in reference to things Tibetan to think of secrecy, secrecy, this tantric category. It has to do with esoteric, and frankly, that's bunk as a way of looking at things. One of the most secret domains in Tibet was metallurgy. People involved in casting statues and other metallurgical work were among the most highly secretive practitioners in Tibet. We know through architects as well, and the late Dunjun Rinpoche once complained to me that with the transitions that had taken place, one of the areas in which traditional knowledge was most completely lost was traditional architecture, because the masters of the art kept their own little private family notebooks with information, and to the extent that that was not preserved and the knowledge of how to read and interpret them, there was no other source. What we have to understand about Tibet is, as in Europe before the publication of Diderot and D'Alembert Encyclopédie, any specialized knowledge was knowledge held by essentially a guild, a family, a closed professional circle, and was the source of their power, authority, income, and station. This, even though perhaps the term Kagya is not used all over the place, that's a little bit unusual. From a sociological point of view, this falls into, I think, a very clear pattern, and it shouldn't be surprising. It's surprising only because we've come to this kind of habit of foregrounding esoteric tantra in terms of Tibet, and it's really been a silly way to regard Tibetan social history overall.
Okay, well, let's look at the last one. So
Sure.
You mentioned you questioned Jean-Luc Achard's Yetri Karpo Tassel as an antecedent for Longchenpa's work. I think that would date to about the time of Vimla Mitra, at least in Burma history.
Achard dates it to the 12th century.
Oh, I see. So I've never known Jean-Luc to take a criticism lying down. Have you run this by him, and has he had a rejoinder?
We haven't yet discussed this in particular. But I mean, certainly Jean-Luc had worked on this before the discovery of the Tsigden Chukchipa, and I wouldn't be surprised if he felt at least some need for revision in the light of the availability of that text. Yeah.
What were the motives of the fifth Dalai Lama in sealing up whole libraries?
Well, you'll have to ask him. I can't speak to motive in great detail, but the fifth Dalai Lama succeeded after a period of protracted bloody civil war in Tibet to impose a reunification through Mongol mercenary armies. And emerging evidence suggests it was not immediately the case, but within a decade or so his consolidation of power began to be recognized that the suppression of the old centers of power that had opposed him, notably the regime of the Tsangpa kings, could not be accomplished without equally the control and suppression of the, if you will, ideologies with which they were associated. Given the role of the Chonangpa and the Kagyupa as the court chaplains of the Tsangpa kings, the presumed loyalty of factions in Tibet to the Tsangpa kings that were mediated by their loyalty to the Chonangpa and to the Kagyupa. The fifth Dalai Lama and his partisans seem to have arrived at the conclusion that to ensure that the shrub would not grow back, they had to get to the roots. And that meant not simply extirpating the Tsangpa king and his clan, but the whole network of religious and political entities that fed into the support system. Yeah.
You mentioned you mentioned the printery or the library at Kapstein. And I was wondering how big it was, if you know anything about it, and the kind of circulation that a text that
I don't know anything about myself about the size of the Daglagambo printery at its fullest. I mean, I keep coming across kind of surprises, things that were published at Daglagambo that I had no knowledge of. I don't know if Gene Smith had, it's likely that Gene had better knowledge on this. Gene had sort of been slowly and on the side working toward a history of Tibetan printing that he, of course, never realized, and this is a tragedy for the field because there has never been, and not likely to be anytime soon, anyone better prepared to write a history of Tibetan printing than Gene Smith. But there are some notes in the writings of Kato Tsewan Norbu regarding printing at Daglagambo, but he doesn't provide a complete parto. So, in short, I don't really know. I'm pretty sure that they did the collected works of Dakotashi Namgyal, and they certainly did a number of other works that Dakotashi Namgyal had edited, but the exact extent of the printery. Circulation is, of course, an interesting issue, and as I pointed out in my remarks at the beginning about Nepal, I mean, blocks could exist and circulation be terrible because the conditions for printing and distribution of prints very often were highly unsatisfactory. I mean, there are some places from which prints came to be relatively well distributed. For example, Natang, the Natang Kagyu and Tengyur came to be very well distributed, but usually in awful copies. And the reason that they were both well distributed and the copies were awful was because the printing of a certain number of Kagyurs and Tengyurs for distribution by the Tibetan government was a tax obligation on Natang imposed by the central Tibetan government. And as with tax obligations anywhere in the world, they fulfilled them as cheaply as they conceivably could. Yeah.
As these libraries have become more accessible, has there been any attempt to assess or catalog the Sanskrit manuscripts that may be held in them?
There is actually, I believe it is a formally completed project now, but its results have not yet been published. The Tibetan, the government of the Tibet Autonomous Region, with support from the central administration, undertook a project beginning about 5-6 years ago now, to photograph every scrap of Sanskrit in the whole Tibetan Autonomous Region, and to catalog all of it. So yeah, they've been doing that. I assume that one of these days there will be a published catalog that will be available. Access remains a terrible problem.
Matthew, that includes the Potala collection?
Yes. Yes. The Potala collection of Sanskrit manuscripts. Yes, it does.
How about the Tibetan collection? You know, Potala and Labrang and all of those.
The Potala, there have been several catalogs issued for the Potala collections. I don't think they're exhaustive, but you have some pretty good catalogs for large parts of the Potala collection. There's a hand list for Labrang that was done, I think, in the 1950s and has been reissued in several forms since. Labrang remains a terrible problem for access, even among, I mean, I know Tibetans who are well placed in administration in China who, you know, are ready to tear out their hair owing to the difficulties of gaining access to anything at Labrang. This is a notorious problem. Materials through, I mean, again, Western scholars have no hope with this. But as I pointed out with the Longchenpa material, one of the manuscripts that they used was the Potala manuscript. And so people operating within the right channels in China have been able to gain some access to some of these things.
Do you have an idea of fathom how many there are that you don't have access yet?
I really didn't do numbers. I mean, there are 3 volumes of published catalogs so far of the Potala collections, but I don't know how. I never sat down and looked at the actual numbers and thought about it that way. It's a very, very extensive collection. Yes.
You mentioned the Rachung Puk collection.
Yes.
Simon Heduk's text. The disciples were active in Rachung Puk. Do you know anything about what happened with those specific printings that came from
Rachung Puk was utterly decimated in the Cultural Revolution. To my knowledge, there's nothing of the old printery that remained. And I'm not even sure to what extent material from the old printery was still present and available in 1959. I really don't know of that. There are quite a few prints from Rachung Puk, but they're old copies that were collected by Giuseppe Tucci and are in Tucci's collection in Rome. And there's a scholar now based in Munich, a young scholar named Marta Sanesi, who's been working on Tucci's collections of old Kagyu materials, particularly the Tsanyin Heiruka prints.
Okay, so maybe we should give Matthew a break. And you're all invited. There's a reception in back. You're all invited to help yourselves to dinner. And I want to end by thanking one more time Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche and the Khyentse Foundation for making all of this possible. So thank you.
What did you get?